As someone once famously said, now for something completely different. Last month, I went on holiday to the southwest of England. Where did I go? Well, the Romans would have known it as Aquasulis, but today you probably know it better, simply as Bath. It was not a deliberate choice to book my holiday during the same week as this year's Jane Austen festival, although it was a very welcome bonus and it has given me a couple of ideas for future videos. I'm not even going to pretend that this video will cover everything that is worth seeing in Bath. There's only so much a person can do in 4 days. Sadly, I can't tell you anything useful about the Roman baths or the Abbey or the Fashion Museum. Apart from the fact that the Fashion Museum is closing at the end of this month, that is October 2022, because they're moving to a new location somewhere else in the city. It may not open for another 3 to 8 years. So if I actually do get to the Fashion Museum, then it's almost certainly going to be after my 40th birthday. Walking around Bath is like stepping back into the 18th century. Even the premises occupied by well-known high street names have got something of a classical feel to it. There are just so many incredible Georgian buildings. The Romans settled in Bath in the 1st century with the intention of worshipping their goddess, Sulis Minerva, which is where the name Aquasulis comes from. And it appears that they also discovered that they really quite liked the naturally warm thermal springs that they found there. On York Street, a very Roman-style tablet describes the original baths as unequalled. Only about a millennia and a half later, in the 1660s, did somebody come up with the cunning idea to bottle and sell spring water of Bath. And by the 1700s, it had started to transform itself into the spa town that I always thought it was. I thought it began as a spa town in Roman times and just carried on through to the present. Apparently not so. Fashionable and presumably quite wealthy people started to come to visit. It became a place to be seen, to play cards, to dance, enjoy yourself, maybe even meet a potential spouse. And when I walked past the pump room on Stall Street, I saw Kings and Queens Baths inscribed on the building. The architecture initially made me think that the Kings and Queens Baths were 18th century. Apparently not. The original King's Baths, which were mixed, were built way back in the 12th century, so that's about 100 years after William the Conqueror arrived. The Queen's Baths, which, as you might deduce, was ladies only, came about 400 years later. I think that's quite a compelling argument against the idea that medieval and Tudor people just did not wash. Clearly they did. You can still experience the spa elements of Bath for yourself in the more modern alternative, the Thermi-Spa. And some text on the wall by one of the pools told me that the waters of Bath are naturally warm. I will bear witness to this. Yes, they definitely are. More or less body temperature actually, which is fantastic because it means you completely avoid that too cold feeling that you often get when you get into a swimming pool. It's also got a very high mineral content And just for the record, in case you're wondering, my skin and hair felt fantastic afterwards. It's a pretty good bonus. If you want an example of how walking around Bath is just like stepping back in time, the Royal Mineral Water Hospital is quite a good way to start. First suggested in the 1710s, the project was backed by all sorts of influential people, including a Dr. William Oliver, who I'll come back to shortly, and the very fashionable Richard Nash, Bath's Master of Ceremonies, best known to history as Beau Nash. He was the important one. He was the one who decided whether visitors were good enough to socialise with the elite members of Bath society. He was the one that you wanted to make a good impression on. And what I really love about the writing on the wall of the hospitals is that the numbers are engraved in just the same kind of curving script that you will often see on gravestones from the early 1700s if you ever come across any in a churchyard. So they're either working with the technology available in terms of carving stone at the time, or they're also being influenced by the fact that it was a fashionable font. If you know anything about Bath, you might know that there are one or two famous landmarks and famous addresses within the confines of the city. One of these is the Circus, where you can find today some examples of plaques commemorating the fact that really famous people live there. Robert Clive, Lord Clive, as in Clive of India, lived at number 14 during his final years. 10 years earlier, his neighbour, an artistic type by the name of Thomas Gainsborough, perhaps you've heard of him, had moved into number 17 with his wife and children. So it just amazes me to think people who would become well-known figures in British history living round the corner from one another. Did they take in parcels for each other? It makes you wonder. Clearly Bath was the place to be if you were anybody who was anybody 250 years ago. Let us venture now onto Queen Square, where I hope you will grant me just a moment's indulgence. As a family historian, one thing I have learnt is that you should check your files before you travel anywhere, just to see if there are any addresses that you can look up that relate to your own family history. Through researching my paternal grand's side of the family, I discovered that her great-aunt Elizabeth Worsley, who was born at Loughton near Lee in what is now Greater Manchester, was Lancashire, and also went on to marry her first cousin, was living at 3 Queen Square when she died on New Year's Day 1932. So how could I resist going to see what it looks like now? On the wall next door, I saw a little circular plaque with the words Bath, Sun, Fire written around the edge. Bath Fire Office existed by the year 1767. We're going back to 1767 again. And its whole purpose was to let people insure their houses against fire damage. And this is of course a time when candles are being used as light sources, when fires and curtains and carpets are needed because you have got no central heating. You're in a time where everybody would have been wearing clothes made of natural fibre, which means that if they catch fire, they're going to burn, they won't melt like modern synthetics. Everybody must have been constantly aware that they were living in this really flammable world. So I totally understand why the occupant of 4 Queen Square thought it was a good idea to take out fire insurance. I think I would have done the same. Outside number 16 Queen Square, there's another one of those little heritage plaques, which reveals that the current property was built on the site of the home of the previously mentioned Dr. William Oliver. He was born in the 1690s, and besides getting involved with the Royal Mineral Water Hospital, he also found time to invent a biscuit, which we now know as the Bath Oliver. And I have since learnt that a group of people have been inspired by this Bath Oliver to set up a society devoted to its preservation. They want to keep the Bath Oliver in production. They've got a website, they've got a Twitter feed. I think that is absolutely wonderful. People have come together to support a biscuit. Let's go somewhere else in Bath. To Pulteney Bridge. Very, very famous Pulteney Bridge. It was designed in the second half of the 18th century by Robert Adam, who also worked on Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire and Harewood House in Yorkshire. He's obviously able to adapt his abilities to suit different projects. When Robert Adam was working, the Palladian style of architecture was considered very fashionable. If you have seen the 1995 version of Pride and Prejudice, which was filmed at Lyme Park here, Lyme Park was used for the exterior shots of Pemberley, and that is quite a good example of a Palladian style building. But Pulteney Bridge doesn't actually look anything like the exterior of Lyme Park. It doesn't even look like any other kind of Palladian building either. Why was this? Because Robert Adam was something of a rebel. He wanted to go against the popular trend. He wanted to design something a bit more experimental and expensive. His plan for Pulteney Bridge should have cost £1,000 in 1769. Like a lot of good ideas, it went considerably over budget. It finished costing something in the region of £10,000. That's seriously over budget. I wouldn't have wanted to be the person who had to finance that. You can't drive over Pulteney Bridge, but you can walk or cycle. And from there you can also go on to Great Pulteney Street. So maybe we should do that next. You've only got to look at Great Pulteney Street to realise that this residential road was designed to be impressive. It was designed to astonish people. It's the longest, widest street in Bath. It's 100 feet wide, in fact. I'm 5 feet tall, so we'd need 20 of me just to get across the road. It was commissioned by Sir William Pulteney and designed by an architect called Thomas Baldwin. So maybe there's actually an argument there to say that it should have been called Baldwin Street, but obviously money and status went a long way in the 1700s. The 1851 census for Bath certainly backs up my initial thought that Great Pulteney Street was where the wealthy were to be found. At number 56 lived Robert Page, a magistrate and an army captain, with his family and his 4 servants. Whereas at number 59 there was Caroline Howlett, an earl's daughter, and her 12 servants, including 2 butlers, a housekeeper, a lady's maid, and a couple of footmen. That's quite something. If my research is correct, she was not only the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel William Lowther, the 1st Earl of Lonsdale, she was also the wife of William Vane, the 3rd Duke of Cleveland. I'm not totally sure that's who she was, but all the dates seem to fit. So she was quite high up in society. And not too far away, on Johnston Street, I found another plaque to somebody really quite famous in a different way. A certain William Pitt lived there. Pitt the Younger, in fact. He lived there for just a few years, not long before he became Prime Minister. I won't say that the parade gardens were specifically on my things to see while I was in Bath list. They were more something that I happened upon, but they are worth a look. Normally there is a small charge to go in, but I was actually visiting Bath in that period between the death of Queen Elizabeth II and her funeral, which was about 10 days later. And owing to the Queen's death, the entry charge had been suspended temporarily, which I wasn't expecting at all. I don't know whether the parade gardens are best described as a gardens or a park. There are flower beds, there's a view of the river and the weir. There are statues, including one of Mozart and also Prince Bladud, who has got some ancient connection to Bath, I think. There's a small cafe, there's plenty of benches to sit on, although it was actually dry when I went, so I just sat on the grass. And there's also this very, very sweet little sheltered rocky area, which when I looked at it a bit more closely, I discovered is actually a very small pet cemetery complete with gravestones. I think that is lovely. But there's one last feature of Bath that I also want to mention in this video. The really famous one. It didn't take me too long to realise is that if I walk to and from my accommodation in a particular direction, it was totally possible to walk past the Royal Crescent every single time I went in and out of Bath. I have no idea how John Wood the Younger worked out how to get that seamless curve into the building, but he certainly did. The work began, strangely enough, again in 1767. That was obviously the year to do things. It was also the same year that my ancestors, Joseph Hurst and Margaret Preston, were getting married and setting up home together miles away in Ormskirk. But it wasn't finished until 7 years later, which actually I find very impressive considering the size and the shape of the Royal Crescent. That they did that in 7 years is astonishing. I have read that there are only 30 houses that make up the crescent, but looking at it, somehow I feel that there should be more in there. One thing we family historians know about houses is that you usually find people inside them. Where there are people, there are usually interesting stories, there are experiences, and just occasionally there may be a tiny bit of scandal too. Outside number 11, the Crescent, a metal plaque quietly tells people that one evening, 250 years ago, Elizabeth, the daughter of Thomas Linley, eloped from that address with a certain Richard Brinsley Sheridan. There's already something dramatic about that. It almost reminds me of 16-year-old Lydia Bennet running away from Brighton with Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice. Which is even more fascinating when you realise that Elizabeth Linley was also only 16 when she and Richard Sheridan absconded. And I've come across this very informative article published by Sarah Murden in 2014, which I'm going to put a link to in the video description, because it contains so many aspects of this story that I just have no idea about. So I really think that article deserves a lot of credit for what I'm able to tell you next. It also mentions the fact that Sheridan's memoirs would have us believe that he and Elizabeth made it to France, where they were married, in a village near Calais in the spring of 1772. But of course, Elizabeth, by the standards of the day, was underage. Being under 21, she needed her father's consent to get married. So just over a year later, long after they returned from Calais, another wedding took place in April of 1773, presumably this time with parental consent. But unfortunately, the marriage was not quite as happy as that elopement and a duel that Sheridan fought with another man because he made unwelcome advances toward Elizabeth might suggest. The couple had differing opinions on where they should live. Elizabeth was a talented singer by all accounts, but Richard really did not like the idea of her earning money through public performances once she was a married woman. But nevertheless, Elizabeth was quite determined, I think, to be her own person. She attended political rallies long before anyone had even thought about the campaign for women's suffrage. She was just there supporting the candidates. She and Sheridan did have one son together, but I've found at least one other source that suggests that their relationship was generally tempestuous. Sheridan began to have affairs So eventually Elizabeth had one too, with an Irish aristocrat, and this resulted in the birth of their daughter Mary in March of 1792, almost exactly 20 years after she first eloped with Richard Sheridan. 3 months later, Elizabeth, who was not in particularly good health, died from tuberculosis. She was only 38. I feel a certain connection there because I too have just turned 38 as well. So it's quite sobering to realise how short that life was. According to an article I found on the Bath magazine website, Richard Sheridan was absolutely devastated by losing Elizabeth, to the point where he was fully prepared to raise baby Mary as his own child, even knowing that biologically she wasn't. And this he did until Mary also died at the age of just 18 months. It's really quite a tragic ending, isn't it? Now that I'm home, I am really glad that I bothered to photograph those metal plaques. The stories that I have discovered just from doing a tiny bit of research from the snippets of information written on them have left me in absolutely no doubt that 18th and 19th century Bath was anything but dull. I would have loved to have walked around there at the time. It would have been an interesting place.